Red dust hung in the air, like a breath held too long. The afternoon light slanted through the warped glass of Briggs General Goods, catching on faded candy jars and coffee tins with worn-out labels. Behind the counter, Nalaya Briggs kept wiping the same patch of wood, her calloused hands rough from soap, her nails cut short, her sleeves rolled high against the western heat. At 23, she'd grown used to how the town saw her, the plain girl who stayed behind. No one noticed her. No one pitied her. No one chose her. They said her skin was too dark, her hair too curly, her eyes too quiet. She took after her father more than her mother, and that wasn't meant as praise. Nalaya ignored the talk the same way she ignored the lazy creak of the ceiling fan overhead. This store was her whole world now. The only thing she could keep standing while the rest of the Briggs family had fallen to debt and drink. Outside, the wind carried the smell of dust and horse sweat. Her father, once a colored soldier after the war, was likely at the saloon again, trading his battlefield memories for a bottle of rye. He used to believe in the word freedom. Now he only knew how to bow his head. That morning, Nalaya had overheard two women talking right outside the store's steps. Old Briggs is marrying his daughter off. $200 in debt. Crenshaw said he'll wipe it clean if he takes the girl. Poor thing. But what choice does a woman have out here? The words cut like thorns. Nalaya bent her head and kept sweeping, though no broom could clear the weight pressing on her chest. The bell above the door jingled, just old Perry buying his tobacco. He nodded, silent as always. People came here only to buy. No one ever stayed. Nalaya counted his change, placed it in his palm, and stood still, eyes drifting toward the window. Main Street of Wild Rose Valley shimmered in the sun, stretching toward the horizon where a golden haze was rising. A line of riders, probably a cattle crew passing through. Her heart tightened. Cowboys usually brought noise, laughter, whiskey, and never once a glance in her direction. If they saw her at all, it was through the glass, a blur not worth noticing. But this time was different. Among them rode a man taller than the rest, straight-backed, his pace steady. Sunlight brushed the brim of his hat and the ridge of his cheekbone. He didn't smile. He didn't whistle. As his horse passed the storefront, a gust of wind lifted the dust, clouding the glass, and through that pale storm, their eyes met. Blue, like the sky after rain. He didn't tip his hat, didn't look away, just watched, quietly, directly, as if memorizing her face. For a heartbeat, the store disappeared. The shelves, the debts, the wind, gone. Only that gaze remained, slow, certain, stilling the world around her. Then the hoofbeats faded. The dust settled. Nalaya realized she was still standing, fingers clenched around her rag. She shook her head, muttered under her breath, "Foolish girl, don't go dreaming now." But the calm wouldn't come. All her life, people had looked at her with pity, disdain, or not at all. No one had ever looked at her as if she was meant to be seen. Outside, the wind quieted. Far down the road, the tall rider, Elias Boone, turned his head back toward the small store where sunlight still clung to the glass. He didn't yet know her name, but he knew one thing for certain. Before he left Wild Rose Valley, he'd find a reason to come back and see the girl behind the counter again. The western trail outside Wild Rose Valley lay under a fine layer of dust, soft as smoke. Elias Boone's crew moved slow, the herd behind them tossing tired heads, the sound of hooves blending with the dry wind. Elias was 27, a man who'd crossed 3 territories and slept beneath skies so thick with stars they felt close enough to touch. He knew the smell of wet grass after rain, the bitterness of coffee boiled with well water, and the hollow sound of loneliness on the long road. His mother had died when he was 14. Since then, he'd gone from ranch to ranch, trading his labor for food, learning to read the wind and keep his word. Life to him was stripped bare, horse, reins, and a single creed: trust. Trust in himself, in the land, and in the few men who sometimes kept their promises. When the crew reached Wild Rose Valley, the sky cracked open into a honey-colored dusk. The town was small: a church, a saloon, a hotel, and one old general store with a faded wooden sign: Briggs General Goods. "Boone," called Harrington, the foreman, voice rough and clipped. "Get the supplies. We're staying one night. Move it." Elias nodded, tied his horse at the post, and pushed through the door. The bell above it rang softly. The smell of old wood and soap powder stopped him for a moment. The girl behind the counter turned. Light from the back window caught in her dark hair, making it glint copper at the edges. She wore a plain, earth-colored dress, collar buttoned to the throat, hands still dusted with flour. No paint, no practiced smile, just quiet. A quiet so deep, it slowed something in him. "Afternoon," he said, voice low, roughened by days on the trail. "I'm here for a few things: coffee, dried beans, paper, if you've got it." She nodded without looking up. "We do. What kind would you like?" Her tone, polite, steady, neither timid nor warm, made him pay attention. "The cheapest," Elias said, his gaze drifting around the room. Everything was neat, arranged with careful hands, too careful for such a worn little store. Then he noticed the cracked mirror on the table behind her. For a fleeting second, his reflection stood beside hers, a dusty drifter next to a girl standing upright, her focus fixed as if holding the world in place by sheer will. He stepped closer. "You seem to know this work well," he said quietly. She lifted her eyes. They were dark, deep, like the still water at the bottom of a well. "I've run it myself since my mother passed," she said. "My father doesn't help much anymore." Elias went silent. He knew that tone, the faint tremor of someone who had carried too much for too long. "Do you run the place alone?" he asked again, softer this time, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. "Since my mother passed," she repeated, her voice low but steady. Their eyes met. No smiles, no flirtation, just recognition. She didn't look away right away. But when she did, she hid her gaze behind the ledger book. Something shifted in Elias's chest. No one had looked at him like that since his mother, not with curiosity or judgment, but simply with seeing. He placed a few coins on the counter. "Your father, where is he now?" "At the saloon, I suppose," she said quietly. "Trying to pay a debt, or drinking to forget it." The silence that followed felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. Elias picked up the sack of goods, then paused at the door. "My name's Elias Boone," he said, his voice calm but sincere. "If you need anything brought from the next town, I can manage it. We'll be here till morning." She answered, "I don't need anything, but thank you." When he stepped out, the bell chimed again, a sound too soft for the wind to carry. Through the dusty window, Nalaya watched his figure fade into the amber light, tall, quiet, as if he carried with him a peace she'd forgotten existed. And as the door swung shut, she stood still, his name echoing like the refrain of a song she didn't know she'd been waiting for. Elias Boone. For the first time in years, her heart was not silent. Evening settled over Wild Rose Valley in shades of deep honey. In the distance, flocks of crows drifted home, thin black ribbons across the fading light. Nalaya closed the ledger, snuffed the oil lamp, yet her chest felt restless, as if she'd lost something she couldn't name. That afternoon, he had come back. Elias Boone, arms full of rope and a quiet smile, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He paid, lingered a moment longer than he needed to. "Thank you, Miss Briggs," he said. "I've got a question. Any place here a man can get a decent supper? Not the loud kind. The saloon's all noise and whiskey." "There's Mrs. Hollister's Inn, across the road," she answered. "She serves meals to travelers." "Then I'll try it," he said, pausing, his tone turning soft. "If you happen to be there tonight, I'll take it as a lucky sign." Nalaya didn't answer. When he left, she stood still, listening to her own heartbeat in the quiet that followed. She'd never been asked to supper before, not the polite, passing kind, but a real invitation. The thought followed her all afternoon like breath, sweet and frightening. By dusk, she found herself in front of the cracked mirror near the window. The woman staring back wasn't remarkable. Dark skin, gentle eyes dulled by fatigue, hair wrapped neatly in a faded scarf. She meant to stay home, but somehow her hands untied the apron, reached for the one dress still whole, a deep blue cotton. She tucked a small white wildflower into her hair. "Just once," she whispered. "Just once to believe I could be someone else." The inn glowed against the night, the scent of baked bread and stew spilling out onto the street. When Nalaya stepped inside, a few heads turned. She almost turned back, until Elias rose to his feet. "Miss Briggs," he said with a quiet smile, tipping his head slightly. "I was afraid you wouldn't come." Mrs. Hollister gave them a knowing look before gesturing to an empty seat. "Sit down, sweetheart. There's a spot right next to this cowboy." Elias waited until she was seated. They ate amid the soft clatter of cutlery and murmured talk of strangers. At first, Nalaya said little, keeping her eyes on her plate. But Elias didn't press her. He talked just enough, about nights spent guarding cattle in storms, about getting lost once in the desert and letting his horse find the way home. When the plates were nearly empty, he asked, "Do you often eat out like this?" "No." "Because of work?" "Because I'd rather not give the town something to talk about." He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "I don't belong anywhere either," he said. "Sometimes I think men like me were made to keep moving, not to stay." "And I," Nalaya murmured, "was born in a place that never quite wanted me." Their eyes met across the flicker of the candle. No words followed. They didn't need them. Some things were understood without sound. After a moment, Elias spoke again, voice low as a confession. "Some people shine quiet, Miss Briggs. You just don't notice it until the light hits right." Nalaya looked up. The candlelight brushed her face, turning her dark skin golden, soft as melted honey. Elias glanced away quickly, afraid that if he held her gaze any longer, she'd see what he couldn't yet say. They left the table together, stepping out onto the wooden porch where the night wind slid through the doorframe. In the distance, a horse whinnied faintly, the call of the long road waiting. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," Nalaya said, fingers brushing her skirt. "That was a pleasant supper." "Thank you for coming," he replied. "Not everyone would share a meal with a drifter." "I don't think you're a drifter," she said, half smiling. "You just haven't found where you belong yet." Elias bowed his head, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Maybe I'm starting to." The words drifted into the night. No promise, no rush. Yet both felt it. A quiet warmth. Not from fire or whiskey, but from being seen, heard, understood. That night, when Nalaya returned home, she removed the wildflower from her hair and placed it inside her journal. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but because, for the first time in her life, her heart had stirred under the gentlest look of all. Morning rose early over Wild Rose Valley. Not the burning kind that scalded the plains, but a soft amber light that spread like honey across the dry fields. Elias Boone stood outside Briggs General Goods, hat in hand, his leather coat slung across one shoulder. He'd half expected she wouldn't come. But just as the sun broke over the ridges, the door opened, and Nalaya Briggs stepped out in a plain brown dress, her hair wrapped neatly with a pale blue scarf. "You're here early," she said, her voice still touched with sleep. "Didn't want to miss the best part of the day," Elias replied, a faint smile curving his lips. "And I thought, maybe you ought to see it too." She looked at him a moment, hesitant, thoughtful, then nodded. "I have an hour before customers come." "That's plenty." They walked beyond the edge of town, past wooden fences and swaying dry grass, the air carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. In the distance, a small creek wound its way through the valley, sunlight dancing on its shallow ripples, clear enough to mirror the whole sky. "This is where I used to come," Nalaya said, stooping to pick up a smooth stone. "My mother brought me here when the weather was kind. She'd say, 'Water remembers everything it touches.'" Elias sat on the bank, arms resting loosely on his knees. "Do you believe that?" "Not anymore," she answered with a faint, wistful smile. "After she died, I never came back until today." The silence that followed was gentle, like breath. A few wildflower petals drifted onto her shoulder. Elias watched as she brushed them off. Such a small, tender movement, it caught him off guard. Nalaya had never left Wild Rose Valley. Her life had been hemmed in by the store's walls, her father's bitterness steeped in whiskey, and the town's whispers about her color, her name, her poverty. The world beyond the hills was something she'd only seen in her mother's stories. Elias spoke of his travels, deserts, mountain trails, open plains. Every place, he said, had its own voice in the wind, its own scent in the soil, and every sunset made him wonder why a man kept wandering when what he sought might be stillness. She listened quietly, her eyes following his hands as he skimmed the water's surface, rough, work-worn hands that somehow moved with care. "If you've never left this valley," he said softly, "then I'll bring the world to you." A simple sentence, yet it hung between them like a vow. Nalaya lowered her gaze, afraid he'd see the sudden smile rising unbidden to her lips. As they walked along the water's edge, a gust of wind lifted a few loose strands of hair across her cheek. Elias reached out instinctively to brush them away, then stopped halfway. The space between them felt thin, fragile. Across the creek stood a small rock ledge. She stepped forward to cross, but the stones were slick. Elias offered his hand, wordless. Nalaya placed hers in his. His palm was warm, steady, trembling just a little, as if he too feared to disturb the moment. They crossed together. She slipped once. He caught her. And suddenly they were close. Close enough to hear the rhythm of each other's breathing. Close enough for the world to fade into water and wind. For the first time, Nalaya saw his face in full daylight, the sun tracing the planes of his cheek, his eyes blue as thawed sky. Something inside her stilled, uncertain where to look. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, as if confessing a secret, "I'm not beautiful, Elias." He didn't let go. The wind stirred their shadows across the rippling water, and he answered, his voice low, steady, meant for her alone. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The words fell into the quiet and stayed there, reaching the part of her that had long gone silent out of fear of hope. Nalaya didn't know how to respond. She only knew her pulse was loud in her ears, her hand still resting in his, her heart wanting to believe. Far off, the sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the water. Its reflection caught her face, no longer tired, no longer burdened, but touched with a calm radiance, as if the morning itself had been made for her. They sat by the creek until the wind shifted. Neither spoke again. But something in both of them knew. Two lonely souls had found, if only for this hour, the place they belonged. And within Nalaya, something quiet yet fierce began to grow. The belief that, perhaps for the first time, she was seen not through the eyes of the world, but through the heart of a man who knew how to stop and truly see. The morning Elias had to leave, the sky turned a pale gray, soft mist clinging to rooftops and shrubs around Briggs General Goods. Nalaya stood on the porch, her hands hidden in her apron, trying to steady the ache rising in her throat. She had always known this day would come. Men like Elias Boone were born for the open trail, for places without names. But when she saw his figure leading the horse through the gate, her heart still clenched as though something inside her were being gently pulled away. He stopped at the steps, hat in hand, the early wind lifting strands of sun-colored hair damp with sweat. His eyes were bright but heavy, not with goodbye, but with something that felt like a promise. For a moment, neither spoke, only the sound of the horse breathing, the wind against the fence, and the quiet of two people caught between holding on and letting go. Elias broke the silence first. His voice was low, roughened by feeling. "I've got to ride north with the herd. New contract. 6 weeks, maybe a bit less." Nalaya nodded, her gaze dropping to his work-worn hands. She didn't believe in promises, not since long ago. People had promised before, to stay, to love, to change, and each had left her with silence. But the way Elias spoke made her want to believe, against reason. He reached for the silver chain around his neck, thin, with a worn coin for a pendant. Not fine jewelry, but something treasured, burnished by years of being carried close. "My mother's," Elias said, placing it in her palm. "She told me to wear it, to remember there's always a place to come back to, but I think now it belongs somewhere else." Nalaya tried to give it back, but his hand closed gently over hers. "Keep it," he said softly. When I come back, I'll ask for your hand with it. The words weren't dressed up like a vow, yet they landed truer than any oath she'd ever heard. She tried to smile. You're sure you'll come back? Elias met her eyes. I've never been surer of anything. Then he turned, mounted up. The sun broke over the ridge, drawing a pale ring of light around him, as if the day itself wanted to hold him there a moment longer. Nalaya watched until the sound of hoofbeats disappeared into the trees. That afternoon, while tidying the counter, she found an envelope tucked beneath the sugar jar. The handwriting slanted, hurried, but clear. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Nalaya, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. I'll be back before the rains. 6 weeks, no more. I'll bring what I earn from the herd up north. I want to open a store with you, not out of pity, but because I've been too long without a place to call home. If you'll have me, Wild Rose Valley will be that home. Keep the silver chain, to remember someone out there thinks of you every night along the road. Elias. She read it again and again until the ink blurred from her tears. Not of sadness, but of something warm, almost like joy. That night, she clasped the chain around her neck, tucking it beneath her dress, where her heartbeat lived. The metal felt cold for a breath. Then, slowly, it warmed, as though it carried his touch. Each morning after, standing behind the counter, she found herself brushing her fingers lightly against the pendant, as if touching the part of him that had stayed. The townsfolk still gossiped about her father's debts, her future, her place, but for once she didn't hear them, because she had a promise. Not the kind made by dreamers or drunks, but by a man who'd looked her in the eye beneath the morning sun and said, I'll come back. That night, before bed, Nalaya lit a small oil lamp, wrote a few lines in her ledger, and touched the silver coin once more. Against her skin, it was still warm, as if somewhere out on the trail, Elias Boone was riding through the dust and dawn, carrying her face in his mind like a star he meant to follow home. 6 weeks passed, and summer faded into dry gold. The first winds of autumn carried the scent of burnt grass and river mist drifting up from the valley. Nalaya moved through her days as always, opening the store, sweeping the floors, trimming wicks, balancing the books. The only difference was the quiet motion of her hand, now and then, brushing against the silver chain beneath her collar, a small, wordless habit born from waiting. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, she heard hoofbeats on the road. They sounded different, not hurried, not loud, but deep and steady, like a heartbeat traveling through dust. When his shadow appeared in the amber light, she didn't need anyone to tell her. She knew. Elias Boone stopped before the shop, his face darkened by sun, his eyes deeper, but the smile, the same one from the morning he left, had survived the miles. He didn't speak. He only removed his hat and bowed his head. Nalaya didn't answer. She simply opened the door, her hands trembling. That night, the rain came without warning. It drummed against the tin roof, steady as a heartbeat, filling the small upstairs room, once a storage loft, with the soft rhythm of return. Elias sat by the wooden table, the oil lamp throwing a tender glow across his shoulders. His clothes were soaked, the damp darkening the leather, but when she handed him a dry towel, their fingers brushed, just for a second, enough to steal their breath. Neither spoke. Only rain and the faint tang of oil smoke. Elias's gaze moved over the room. The wooden crates, the shelves, the chair patched with a brick for balance. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "I told you I'd come back." Nalaya didn't look up. "I know." Her voice trembled like a thin thread in the rain. He reached into his pocket and set a small bundle on the table. A few coins, folded papers, and a single dried wildflower. "I kept this from one of the places I passed. Every mile I thought of you." She lifted her eyes. The lamplight caught his, turning them into mirrors of the sky. "Were you ever afraid?" she asked softly. "Always moving, never staying?" Elias smiled, the kind of tired smile that carried the dust of too many roads. "I was," he said. "But tonight, I don't want to move anymore. No confession, no declarations. Only the stillness of two souls who had wandered far enough to recognize home." Nalaya stepped toward the window and pushed it open a crack. Cool air swept in, bringing the scent of wet earth and river grass. Elias stood, his steps soundless on the wooden floor, and came closer. The distance between them thinned to a breath. She didn't turn, but he could see her shoulders trembling. He reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. She turned then, her eyes shining in the lamplight, and in that quiet exchange, both of them understood. They had waited long enough to know this was real. His hand found hers. This time, she didn't pull away. Her eyes fluttered closed, and outside the rain grew louder, each drop striking the roof like a soft drumbeat, steady and alive. Elias leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. Not a hurried kiss, but a pause. A meeting of breaths, of warmth, of two people who no longer needed to speak their love aloud. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling the slow, certain rhythm beneath the damp fabric. He caught her hand and held it there, as if to promise he wouldn't let it go again. Outside, the rain thickened. The flame of the lamp swayed and wrapped them in a shifting halo of gold. No distance, no fear, no past large enough to divide them. That night, they made no grand vows. Only breath joined with breath, hands entwined, and rain outside keeping time for something gentle and new. When the last flame dimmed and shadows melted into the sound of rain, the light lingered on their faces, soft, true, at peace. And in the warmth of the man who had crossed 1,000 miles to return, Nalaya knew her heart had finally opened, once, wholly, and for the last time it would ever need to. The next morning dawned clear, too clear, as if the night's rain had never been. Down in the valley, the river slid quietly beneath the new sun, glinting gold between the reeds. Nalaya walked with Elias Boone to the northern ridge, where the trail bent toward open country. He led his horse, shoulders still damp with dew, his face darkened by travel yet softened by calm eyes. "One last trip," he said, voice low and steady. 3 weeks, no more. A friend up north needs help. After that, I'm done moving. I'll come back, and I'll stay." She smiled faintly and nodded, her fingers curling around the silver chain beneath her collar. Promises had a way of sounding like truth, until they turned to silence. Elias touched her cheek, brief, like a whisper of wind, then mounted up and rode into the morning. His figure faded into the dust and the smell of wet earth. The first day after he left, the valley was calm. By the third, clouds gathered thick and low over the western hills. By the fifth, Wild Rose Valley was drowning. The summer storm came without warning. Wind screamed across the rooftops, tearing at shingles and shutters. Rain fell in sheets, like the sky was being ripped open. Nalaya and her father fought to save what they could, moving sacks of flour and crates of salt to the upper shelves, but the wind grew so strong she could barely stand. A heavy branch shattered the roof, letting the flood pour through. Her father slipped, struck his head against the counter's edge. Blood spread across the wet floor, bright against the wood. Nalaya dragged him to safety, her heart hammering, praying the roof would hold through the night. By dawn, the storm passed, leaving ruin behind. Half the store had caved in. The grain, the sugar, the salt, all washed away. Her father lay feverish on the cot, a bandage across his brow, his breath shallow. And then came the whispers. They said John Briggs didn't just owe store credit. He owed gambling money to Harlan Crenshaw, a rich rancher known for his cruelty. 2 days later, Crenshaw came. He stepped through the wreckage in polished boots caked with mud, the smell of tobacco and cheap cologne trailing him. "Heard old Briggs won't make it through the season without help," he said, smiling like a knife. "I can pay off his debt, all of it. In exchange, I want his daughter." Nalaya heard every word. She stepped out from behind the curtain, voice calm but eyes burning. "I'm not something to be traded, Mr. Crenshaw." He smirked, shrugging. "Maybe not. But your father seems to think otherwise." Her father tried to speak, but his strength was gone. When he finally opened his eyes, guilt clouded them. "I'm sorry," he rasped. "I didn't mean for it to come to this, but I've run out of ways to save us." The words hollowed her. She looked around the wrecked store, the wet shelves, the broken chair, the silver chain cold against her skin. Elias had promised he'd be back in 3 weeks. Now it had been 2, then 3, then 4. No word. Each evening, Nalaya stood by the door, watching the fields drowned in mud, the wind whispering like a warning. Don't wait. She cleaned what she could, swept the debris, patched the windows. And when the town began whispering about the arrangement, the wedding set 3 days after her father's recovery, she said nothing. People called it mercy. They called it practical. The night before the wedding, Nalaya sat by the window, holding the silver chain in her hand. Once it had been warm. Now, it was only cold metal. She remembered Elias's eyes, the murmur of his promise, the night rain tapping on the roof above them. All of it felt like fragments of a dream. Soft, unreachable, fading. Outside, the moon rose pale and distant. The wind slipped through the cracked window, making the oil lamp flicker. Nalaya tightened her grip around the chain, eyes closing. She didn't cry. There were no tears left. Only one whisper escaped her lips, carried into the dark. "You promised, Elias. But I've learned that promises don't save anyone." Then she laid the chain on the table and blew out the lamp. In the darkness, only the sound of wind remained, and the stillness of a woman who knew she was about to lose everything, except the last piece of pride she had left. Time in Wild Rose Valley moved like shallow water, slow, murky, uncertain where it might end. 3 weeks turned into 5, then 6. The rains had stopped. Grass grew again where the flood once stood. The store had been patched with scrap wood, still carrying the musty scent of rot. Nalaya's father limped around the porch, eyes dulled with the exhaustion of a man who had borrowed too much from life. No letters came, no riders, no sound of the hoofbeats she knew by heart, no sign of Elias Boone. Every morning, Nalaya opened the store as before, swept the floor, wiped the counter, sold a few small things to townsfolk who spoke too loud and cared too little. But inside the world had gone quiet, as if someone had taken the music out of her life and left only silence. On the 28th evening she went upstairs. Her fingers brushed the silver chain, now cool against her skin. She unhooked it, laid it on the table, and stared. The worn coin reflected her face faintly in the lamplight. Thinner now, eyes ringed with sleepless nights, skin darkened and toughened by the weeks that passed. She whispered, not to anyone, but to the stillness itself. He's gone. Like the others. Like every promise. The sound was small, but something within it cracked. The sound of faith breaking, quiet and final. The next morning, she placed the chain into a small wooden box, the same one that once held her mother's old photographs. She locked it, slid it into the bottom drawer, and closed it for good. From that day on, her collar lay flat, the sunlight no longer catching a glint of silver. Her father avoided her eyes. He knew he had signed something he could never undo. Around town, people whispered, "At least the girl will have a roof and a rich husband." Their words filled the air like damp smoke, thickening the silence in a house that was already too small. The wedding was set for the weekend. Harlan Crenshaw sent fabric, white, coarse, cheap, tinged yellow at the edges. He said it was proper enough. Nalaya accepted it without a word. She carried it upstairs and began to sew. Night after night, the sound of the needle pricking fabric filled the room like the slow beat of a heart that no longer knew how to feel. By Friday, the dress was finished. She rose, hung it by the window. The last light of day poured through, staining the room gold. Nalaya stood before it, and before the woman in the mirror. The woman staring back had her hair tied tight, cheekbones sharp, eyes dim. She put on the dress. The rough fabric scratched her skin, the belt pressed tight against her ribs. Standing before the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The white gown wasn't for a bride. It was for someone being given away to settle a debt. In the reflection, she saw not a girl, not even a dreamer, just a figure that endured. The wounds had closed, but something within still bled, quietly, unseen. The sunset split her reflection in two, half in light, half in shadow. She stared for a long time, then murmured, almost tenderly, "Goodbye, Nalaya." Outside, the evening wind swept through the fields, carrying the dry scent of grass. In the yard below, men were setting up the wedding tent. White fabric strips fluttering between wooden poles like thin threads stretched between fate and surrender. When night came, she folded the dress carefully, set it on the table, and sat by the window. The full moon rose over the hills, its pale light spilling across the floor and touching the hidden box beneath the dresser, the one holding the silver chain, the only proof that a promise had once been real. She didn't open it. She no longer believed in miracles. Only silence remained, long and deep as the breath of night itself. And in that silence, Nalaya understood what every woman of the West learned sooner or later. Love isn't always stolen by cruelty or fate. Sometimes it simply fades into quiet and disappears, as if it had never been called by name. Up in the northern frontier, where the wind scoured the land bare and gray, Elias Boone lived through days that felt endless. He had come to help a friend, a simple land deal, or so he thought, but soon found himself tangled in a dispute between two ranch owners who'd rather draw pistols than sign papers. Documents were seized, cattle held, threats traded, and Elias, who only ever wanted to leave, was trapped once more between promises and guns. 3 weeks passed, then 4, then 6. Each sunset, his thoughts drifted south, to Wild Rose Valley, to the soft light of an oil lamp glinting off Nalaya Briggs's dark hair, to the feel of her hand on his neck as she unclasped the silver chain. He had promised to return, in a world where words were cheaper than dust. That promise was the one thing he still believed in. That morning, as he waited for the dispute to settle, a trader from Montana stopped by with whiskey on his breath and idle gossip in his mouth. "Wild Rose Valley?" he slurred. "Heard the Briggs girl's getting married. Some rich fella bought out her daddy's debts. Name's Crenshaw." Elias dropped his coffee. The hot liquid burned his palm, but he didn't feel it. A minute later, he was on his feet. "Where are you going?" his friend asked. "Home," Elias said, and that was all. He sold every head of cattle he owned, didn't bother to count the money, stuffed it into a saddlebag, and rode out. He didn't stop to rest, didn't look back. The wind lashed his face, dust bit into his lips. The western sun blazed overhead, cruel and golden. His horse's sides were streaked with foam, but Elias pressed on. For 3 days and nights, he barely slept. Every time his eyes drooped, one image pulled him awake. Nalaya, standing behind the counter, her eyes steady when he'd said, "I'll come back." Those words pounded in his skull, the rhythm of each hoofbeat repeating the same desperate prayer. She waited. "I have to make it in time." The first night, he lost the trail in a storm of red dust. The horse stumbled, went down hard. His knee split open. Blood soaked through his trousers. Gritting his teeth, Elias dragged himself up, clutching the reins. "Not yet," he rasped. "Not while she's still waiting." The second night brought a thin rain, rare on the high plains. He tilted his head up, letting the drops wash the grit from his skin, then rode on. The crescent moon hung low, pale as memory. By the third day, his hands were raw, his fingers stiff around the reins. The horse faltered. He patted its neck, voice hoarse. "Just one more night. One more." At dusk, the land opened before him. Red hills rising like embers at the valley's edge. And there, beneath the dying light, he saw it. Wild Rose Valley, wrapped in haze, rooftops glowing faintly, the church steeple sharp against the horizon. Thin strips of white cloth fluttered between wooden poles in the distance, not banners for celebration, but for a wedding. His chest clenched. He didn't need anyone to tell him whose. Elias yanked the reins and spurred his horse down the ridge. Dust erupted beneath the hooves, swirling like smoke. The pounding echoed through the hollow valley, a heartbeat racing against time. By the time he reached the town gate, night had fallen. The lamp over the church door flickered weakly, illuminating a wooden sign. "Wedding ceremony, tomorrow at sunset." Elias stopped. His breath came sharp and ragged. his shoulders trembling with exhaustion. The night wind carried the scent of whiskey, wildflowers, and blood, his own, dried and crusted on his palms. He lifted his head. In the darkness, his eyes burned, blue and bright, fierce with something between faith and fury. 3 days, 3 nights, and he had made it. Not too soon, not yet too late. They said cowboys didn't believe in destiny, but Elias did now. Every road, every scar, every sleepless mile had led him here, to this valley, at this hour. He looked toward the small house with the dim light in the upper window, the one where he had once stood in the rain beside her, and in his chest, one thought beat like a prayer. Let her still be mine to save. Then, through the heavy, red-stained night, Elias Boone spurred his horse forward, back into the town where love had not yet died, to fight for it. Even if he had only one final night left to try. The wind stirred the white drapes on the porch, carrying the damp scent of early rain. Inside the Briggs house, the oil lamp flickered, throwing restless shadows across the wooden walls where 2 men sat across a table stained with whiskey. John Briggs, hollow-cheeked and trembling, poured another glass. Across from him, Harlan Crenshaw, thick-necked, smug, and heavy with the arrogance of a man who believed he owned everything he touched, leaned back, swirling the liquor in his hand. "By tomorrow," Crenshaw said, his voice slick with triumph, "it'll all be settled. Your debt cleared, your name clean. All I need is your daughter to say I do." Briggs nodded slowly, eyes clouded. "She will," he muttered. She has no choice." Rain began to patter against the roof. Upstairs, Nalaya sat by the window, listening. Each word below cut into her like a dull knife. She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking, staring out into the black road beyond the glass. No light, no sound. Only thunder murmuring far away. Then, faintly, came the sound of hoofbeats. At first, distant, then nearer, pounding through the wet silence like the pulse of a desperate heart. She lifted her head, hardly daring to believe, and then came the crash of a door thrown open. Downstairs, Crenshaw's chair scraped back sharply. "Who the hell—" The door burst wide. A man stood framed in the stormlight, shoulders soaked, coat torn, boots caked in mud, eyes blazing beneath the brim of his hat. Elias Boone. The room froze. Crenshaw rose from his chair. Briggs stared in disbelief. Elias stepped forward, slow but steady, swung the leather satchel from his shoulder and dropped it on the table. The sound of coins, sharp, solid, cut through the heavy air. "Every dollar I own," he said, voice rough but sure. "Enough to settle his debt." Crenshaw's laughter cracked the silence, cold and oily. "And you think that buys her, do you?" Elias met his gaze, unflinching. "I didn't come to buy her," he said. "I came to marry her." Upstairs, Nalaya's breath caught. The words echoed up the stairwell like a miracle she'd stopped asking for. She rose, her legs trembling, and descended, slow, deliberate, heart hammering against her ribs. When she reached the bottom step, Elias turned. They looked at each other, and the weeks of silence, of doubt, of pain, all collapsed into a single breath. Briggs bowed his head, voice shaking. "You're too late, Boone. Crenshaw already—" "Then I'll pay it back," Elias interrupted, his eyes never leaving Nalaya. "Not with promises. With work, with blood, with every breath I've got, if that's what it takes." Crenshaw stood, his massive hand gripping the handle of his riding crop. "She's mine," he growled. "Tomorrow she'll stand before God and this town as my wife. You came too late." Elias took one step forward, rain dripping from his hat, brim. "God doesn't bless what's bought with debt and fear." The room fell still. The words hung there like a blade. Crenshaw's eyes narrowed. Then, with a snarl, he flicked his wrist dismissively. "You'll regret this." He stormed out, the door slamming against the wind, rain sweeping into the room. Silence followed, the kind that comes after thunder. Only the smell of wet earth and the ragged sound of breathing filled the space. Elias leaned against the table, knuckles bleeding from the road. Briggs looked between them, guilt and weariness softening his face. "Child, I don't know what to say." Nalaya stepped closer. The lamp flickered, throwing gold across Elias's torn sleeve and hollow eyes. Eyes that still carried the stubborn light of someone who'd crossed a desert to keep his word. She reached up, her hand trembling as it touched his cheek. "You really came back," she whispered. He covered her hand with his, holding it there, his fingers rough, his voice low. "I said I would." Outside, the rain broke loose, tearing down the white banners that hung for a wedding no one would ever see. And in that storm-lit house on the night before vows that were never meant to be, two people who had once lost each other stood together again. The promise between them no longer spoken, but alive, real, and burning quietly in their eyes. Dawn arrived softly, as if afraid to disturb what the night had finally mended. Dew still clung to the roof tiles, glimmering faintly in the pale light. The air smelled of wet soil, sharp, clean, and alive, like the first breath of a valley that had survived its own breaking. Wild Rose Valley was quiet. No church bells, no crowd. Only the faint shifting of horses tied beneath the porch and a handful of wet sparrows preening on the fence. In the small yard behind the store, a worn wooden table was covered with a plain white cloth. No flowers, no wine. Only three people: Elias Boone, Nalaya Briggs, and the old town minister, whose hands had buried more souls than he'd ever bound in marriage. Nalaya's dress was simple: coarse fabric, hand-sewn seams, a round collar, not the kind girls dreamed of. Yet under the tender wash of morning light, it softened, becoming something quieter and far more beautiful. Around her neck, the silver chain had returned, warm again, resting just above her heart. Elias stood across from her. His shirt was white but frayed, his hair still damp from the storm. He hadn't slept. The stubble on his jaw and the dark circles beneath his eyes didn't dull him. They made him real. When she looked at him, her heart fell still. The minister's voice, low and tired, drifted through the cool air. "Do you, Elias Boone, take this woman?" "I do," Elias said. His voice was hoarse but steady. "And do you, Nalaya Briggs?" She looked up at him. The world went quiet. Wind, water, breath, all gone. She could hear only her heartbeat, clear and deliberate, like the sound of life returning. "I do." The minister smiled, weary but kind, and closed his Bible with trembling hands. "Then, by the grace of God, you may kiss your bride." Time stilled. Nalaya lifted her face. In Elias's pale blue eyes she saw no pity, no grand passion borrowed from stories, only faith. Quiet, unshakable, deep as the soil beneath their feet. He raised his hand, rough and weather-worn, and cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear that hadn't fallen yet. "You're home now," he whispered. "No witnesses needed, no applause asked for." Her lips trembled into a smile as he leaned in. Their kiss wasn't fierce, just the meeting of two souls too tired for pretense, too grateful to still be standing. The morning light poured through the mist, tracing soft halos around them. Beyond the ridge, the sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the rain-soaked fields and catching the corner of the white cloth on the table. The minister slipped away quietly, leaving them alone among the puddles and the drooping wild daisies. Elias took Nalaya's hand. Their fingers interlaced perfectly, as though they had always been meant to fit. They said nothing. Words would have broken the spell. Instead, they simply stood together, watching the light spread across the valley. From the church on the hill, the bell finally rang, late, hesitant, but sweet. Its echo drifted over the fields like a benediction. Nalaya turned to him. His eyes were the same as that first night, when lamplight flickered across the wooden walls, and he'd told her he'd come back. And she knew then. They didn't need a crowd, nor celebration. Love hadn't begun in music or ceremony. It had begun in stillness, the moment two weary hearts realized they'd gone far enough to know where they belonged. Elias bent his head, resting his forehead against hers. The breeze carried the scent of rain, of soil, of wood smoke from some faraway kitchen, and in that breath between them, Nalaya whispered, half prayer, half truth, "This time I'm home." Behind them, the day bloomed gold. Light spread through Wild Rose Valley, gentle and whole, a witness that sometimes love doesn't arrive as a miracle, but as a homecoming. A year had passed since that misty morning, the morning when Wild Rose Valley rang its bells not for a funeral, but for a beginning. The dirt road in front of the old Briggs store was no longer empty. Wagons came and went. Laughter spilled from the saloon across the street. On the freshly painted wooden wall hung a new sign, bold and gleaming in the light. Boone and Briggs General Goods. Elias's handwriting, strong yet gentle, carved the name deep, while the gold trim had been painted by Nalaya herself the night before it dried. Each morning, the store smelled of coffee and warm bread. Her father, now sober and steady, moved slowly but surely, stacking crates in the corner. Once a man broken by guilt and whiskey, he had become the quiet keeper of the door, the storyteller for children who came for candy. Every time he looked at his daughter, his smile carried both repentance and pride. Outside, the prairie wind carried the scent of wildflowers. Sunlight spread across the back fields where Elias Boone worked, tying down bundles, checking the new shipment. He looked up when Nalaya stepped onto the porch. Her dress long and sky blue, brushing her ankles like a whisper of summer. Her hand rested gently on her belly, where the first heartbeat of their new life was growing, in rhythm with the land itself. When she came closer, Elias set down his rope and met her halfway. His rough palm covered hers, steady and warm. "You once thought you weren't beautiful, Nalaya," he said, his voice deep and soft, like the wind moving through the valley. "But look at what you've built." She smiled, eyes dark and clear as rain-washed earth. "It isn't beauty," she said quietly. "It's peace." Elias smiled back, the smile of a man who had stopped running because he'd finally found home. They stood together, watching the fields glow gold under the rising sun. horses running free across the ridge, dust curling through the light, and beyond it all, the old creek where they once spoke of the world and their dreams. Nalaya touched the silver chain at her neck, the sunlight glinting over her skin. Once it had been a promise. Now it was proof of everything they'd kept alive, through time, through storms, through the simple act of staying. Inside, her father's voice called out from the store, "Elias, son, give me a hand with this crate." Elias turned, still holding Nalaya's hand. "Don't lift anything heavy," he teased, eyes warm. She nodded, watching him walk back across the porch. The morning light caught his shoulders, tracing the line between shadow and gold. He looked, in that moment, like he belonged to the land itself. Nalaya sat down on the bench, her gaze stretching across the valley. The sky was wide and open, dotted with small birds gliding on the wind. She breathed in, earth, air, sunlight, and smiled. It struck her then. Life didn't need miracles. It only needed two people willing to stay, to rebuild what the world had broken, with their hands and their faith. Elias returned with a small bundle of wildflowers, still damp with dew. He handed it to her. "Wild roses," he said, "for Wild Rose Valley." She looked at him, then at the flowers trembling in the breeze, fragile but strong enough to outlast every storm. Nalaya placed the bouquet on the table and glanced up at the sign above the door. The sunlight caught it just right, the gold letters gleaming softly. Boone and Briggs General Goods. She whispered, almost to herself, "We built this with our hands and our hearts." Elias heard her. He stepped behind her, arms circling her waist, his breath warm against her ear. And in that silence, in the hum of wind and life, she felt his words without him needing to speak them. That love in the West was never born of miracles, but of trust, and of two souls brave enough to stay and heal each other. If you've ever believed that happiness can come late but still be whole, leave a heart below. If you've ever waited in silence for someone who finally came back, share your story, so we remember that love, though delayed, is always worth the wait. Thank you for riding this journey with me. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to keep traveling through more warm-hearted Wild West love stories.